Thank you everyone for being here this evening, and thank you for giving me this opportunity to share with you some of the key findings in my recently published book, From Solidarity to Geopolitics. This book is about the support that new democracies provide for the democratization of other countries. Consider, for example, that the iconic Czechoslovak dissident Václav Havel continued his activism even after Czechoslovakia was free by supporting the democratization struggles of neighboring and faraway countries. And he did so both when he was an activist as well as continued doing so when he was a president of the Czech Republic. In the picture here, you see his several expressions of his solidarity with three opposition movements, but there were, of course, many others that he supported. Václav Havel was, of course, not unique among the activists and policymakers in the Czech Republic, nor is the Czech Republic unique in Central Eastern Europe or among the other new democracies that were born in the wake of the third wave of democratization. And it is precisely this type of effort that is the focus of my book. In the book, I discuss how pro-democracy activists express solidarity, train, provide assistance in terms of funding, as well as advocate on behalf of other pro-democratic activists abroad. I also discuss how newly democratic states provide diplomatic support, democracy assistance, and leverage their membership in various regional and global forums to support the democratization of other countries. And in the book, I try to answer four questions. The first question is, why is it that some new democracies are more active than others in supporting the democratization of other countries? Then I also ask, why is it that those countries choose as recipients a particular set of countries over others? I also look in the question of why is it that those democracy promoters prefer certain types of support over others. And finally, I look at the strengths and limitations of these democracy promoters. By answering these questions, I look to take part in three broader sets of debates in the literature. The first one is about the emergence of a new class of democracy promoters. And those are new democracies. Most of the literature on democracy promotion focuses on the efforts of the West. Those tend to be established democracies and developed economies such as the US, the Nordic countries, the UK, even the EU. But they have really overlooked, or at least not systematically examined, the efforts of some of the newest democracies in the world today. And that's what I hope to do in this book. I also consider the effort of these new democracy promoters as a special case of revolutionary export, because as you will see in the rest of this talk, their own democratic breakthroughs inform their democracy promotion activities in many meaningful ways. And I also see their efforts as an example of the exercise of soft power by regional actors, such as the new democracies in Central and Eastern Europe that I study. I also think about these efforts as an example of diffusion entrepreneurship and theorize it as a mechanism underlying waves of regime change. Most of the literature on diffusion tends to focus on the unfolding and outcome of diffusion processes, and it has tended to understudy the agency of actors, especially ones that have adopted a practice and then went on to promote it further into other countries. And again, this is the focus of my book. So now allow me to turn to my key findings and caveat them by saying that my empirical focus is on the European new democracies in the first 2 decades after the collapse of communism in the region. What I have on this slide is a table which describes the activism of the new Eastern European democracies in supporting the democratization of other countries. And the important line in this table is really the last one, where you will see sort of a single score depicting the level of activism of each country. And again, what you can see is that there is a significant variation in the ways in which the various countries support the democratization of others. On the one hand, you have some, such as Bulgaria, that have invested very little in supporting the democratization of other countries. On the other hand, you have countries such as the Czech Republic, Poland, and Slovakia, who have been quite active in supporting the democratic struggles of other countries, usually in their neighborhood. So that obviously poses a question of how can we explain this variation? Why is it that some countries, such as the Czech Republic, Poland, and Slovakia, why have they been more active than other countries like Bulgaria and Slovenia, or Romania, for that matter? I answer this question in two ways. I look at why is it that some civil society actors or NGOs have been more active, but also why have some states been more active. And I find that Eastern European democracy promotion began with the activities and international solidarity of some of the activists who organized the domestic breakthroughs in these countries. So a number of these activists continued to support the democratization and democratic consolidation of their own country, but they also supported the transnational diffusion of democracy and aided a number of other countries. These activists usually had ties to other pro-democratic activists abroad, and it was through the interactions along those ties that they perceived a duty, an obligation, or a responsibility to support the democratization struggles of their fellow activists abroad. And here, duty, obligation, and responsibility are words that they themselves use to describe the perceptions of the motivations for their activism. So a number of these activists and the NGOs that they worked for, with Western support and encouragement, began to provide technical and moral support to other countries, usually shortly after their own democratic breakthrough. What's interesting, however, is that over time, some of the NGOs in which those activists were embedded began to increasingly use democracy promotion as a way of organizational survival and expansion. Those activists realized that they have, in their own words, expertise to sell. And so they use their embeddedness in a variety of donor networks to, again, provide funding for their own organizations and to keep the lights on. In other words, we see that over time, these organizational concerns came to displace the normative drivers behind much, but not all, of the international democracy promotion work in each of the Eastern European movements that I studied. In addition to supporting the transnational diffusion of democracy, a number of these activists and NGOs advocated that their own government support the democratization of other countries as well. And these NGOs organized advocacy campaigns, and they usually timed those campaigns at various critical junctures in the foreign policy history of their own country. Sometimes did so immediately after their own domestic breakthrough. Others chose to wait until their country entered the EU or NATO. And they also benefited from the support and receptiveness of some of their former opposition allies who had entered politics and were eager to get the input of their civic colleagues and implement policies based on it. However, what I found is that it is only in the cases where these activists represented strong contingents or large and united movements able to articulate resonant arguments that their campaigns were successful and that their states embedded democracy promotion in their foreign policy. Now, let me illustrate that with the example of a somewhat surprising democracy promoter, Slovakia. A small country and a relatively new state, of which you would be surprised to see the kind of active foreign policy that democracy promotion entails. Yet, as you saw on the table on the previous slide, Slovakia is among the most active Eastern European democracy promoters. So how did that begin? Slovakia became independent with the dissolution of Czechoslovakia in 1993, and shortly after that, the democratic transition of the country became arrested by the elites that organized the independence of the country. So the political opposition in the country and civil society used the 1998 parliamentary elections as an opportunity to organize a democratic breakthrough and push the country in a decidedly democratic direction. And it was this campaign that gave the beginning of what would later become known as the wave of color or electoral revolutions in the region. And you saw such revolutions in countries such as Croatia, Serbia, Georgia, Kyrgyzstan, Ukraine, and so on. So these activists immediately recognized that in their campaign they had a useful model for defeating illiberal rulers who were reigning over hybrid or electoral democracies. And that was a realization that was shared by a number of their donors and fellow activists abroad. And so in the year after the Slovak breakthrough, the Freedom House paid for a seminar that allowed some of the key Slovak organizers to share the lessons they had learned in their democratization campaign with pro-democracy activists from countries such as Croatia, Serbia, Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. That initial exchange turned into long-term cooperation and was followed by a number of other similar exchanges. And so eventually, in about 5 or 6 years, there were as many as 12.5 NGOs who were consistently and in a sustained manner providing democracy support abroad. Another interesting fact is that at the very beginning, a number of those NGOs interested in supporting the democratization of neighboring Serbia also decided to approach their state and insist that the Slovak state similarly support the democratization of Serbia. They were successful in convincing their foreign policy makers, namely the foreign minister as well as the ambassador, the Slovak ambassador in Serbia, that just as democracy was an antidote to nationalist illiberalism in Slovakia, so it could solve many of the problems that at the time seemed to be plaguing the Western Balkans. And so democracy promotion, they argued, is a way for Slovakia to stabilize its neighborhood, make it a peaceful and prosperous place. They were successful, as I said, because there was a number of them and they were worked together and managed to propose to their foreign policymakers compelling answers to problems that at the time seemed relevant, yet the Slovak foreign policymakers had not figured out how quite to address them. But I think, again, what's interesting about the Slovak case is that you have quite an unexpected democracy promoter. And again, I see that as a result of the efforts of the civic pro-democracy activists in that country. Again, what's interesting also is that their continued vigilance and advocacy to the state allowed that democracy promotion to continue at the state level, even when power turned over to the successors of the previous illiberal regime. And so even under that set of elites, democracy promotion continued because civil society continued to actively advocate for it, which again to me speaks to the importance of activists and their advocacy for active state policies in support of democracy abroad. Now, allow me to turn your attention to another variation which I discovered and I tried to explain. And that is the variation in the recipients of Eastern European democracy promotion. So what you see in this table is, again, the Eastern European democracy promoters, as well as a range of their priority recipients. The countries with 2 stars are what each of the donors considered to be a priority recipient, whereas the countries, the recipients marked with 1 star, were some of the other recipients that received support from the Eastern European countries. And again, as you see, there is quite some variation in those recipients. So, of course, an interesting question is, how can it be explained? I found that at the level of state efforts, there was some democracy promotion idealism. And there were a number of politicians who paid principal attention to the democratization struggle in other countries. But the efforts that resulted from these principled efforts have been rather ad hoc and episodic. On the other hand, democracy has tended to be understood in Central and Eastern Europe as an improved domestic order. And both civic and political elites in those newly democratic countries expected similar improvements in other countries were those other countries to become democratic. And so many of the arguments that the civic advocates of democracy promotion had with their state counterparts about why their country should be supporting democratization abroad revolved not only about the moral concerns that democracy promotion addressed, but primarily around the geostrategic and general foreign policy challenges that democracy promotion could address. And so in most of these Eastern European countries, democracy promotion became embedded as a foreign policy as a means to creating a more favorable international environment. Let me illustrate this argument with another case study, this time of Poland. In Poland, democracy promotion became a geopolitical strategy for creating reliable partners in the countries near abroad, as well as for deterring Russian aggression. You have to remember that Russia had for centuries threatened Polish independence. And also that for Poland, the transition to market democracy was both a struggle away from communism as a domestic order, as well as a struggle against Soviet imperialism as a way of regaining the sovereignty of the Polish nation state. And so it was this dual purpose of democracy that informed the democracy promotion strategy of the Polish elites today. Poland has tended to support the democratization of its mutual neighbors with Russia. So those are countries such as Ukraine and Belarus, but also Georgia and Moldova. And Poland has tended to believe that were those countries democratic, they would also choose their own sovereignty and would then stay away from the Russian sphere of influence, therefore containing the temptation of Russia to resurge as an imperial power on the European continent. So again, I think what's interesting here is that the rationale that was fleshed out was a product of the conversation between civil society and the state, but also that at the state level, the manifestation that it had was a very security-oriented logic that drove the everyday democracy promotion efforts of the Polish state. Another important question that I look to answer is what shape did the democracy promotion efforts of the Eastern European states actually take? And I found that most of them tended to selectively draw on their own transition experience. They thought about their own democratic breakthroughs and periods of democratic consolidation as an experiment in which they learned many lessons about what worked, but also about what did not work. And they thought about those lessons as recipes, where those are steps to follow to defeat authoritarians and also to achieve particular reform objectives. So they looked to share those recipes with others abroad. And out of all the recipes that they thought they had, most of the Eastern European democracy promoters tried to look for ones that fit the needs of their recipients. And so that's an interesting distinction between these emerging democracy promoters and some of the Western democracy promoters and their efforts, at least in the way that the current literature describes them. So if you look at the way that democracy promotion literature talks about the efforts of the US or the EU, you'd often find descriptions of Western democracy promoters as thinking back to their own domestic models of democracy and thinking of their constituent elements and looking to replicate those elements abroad. The Eastern European countries are doing something very similar, except instead of thinking in institutional terms, they look for reform processes that they can export. And so that has produced a difference in that the Western countries tend to export models of democracy, while the Eastern European countries have tended to export models of democratization. Let me illustrate.